Husband discards his poor pregnant wife. Unaware she's a millionaire now, she returns for payback. The door didn't just slam, it pronounced a sentence. Outside, rain stitched the night into a single sheet of black glass, and in the reflection of the puddles she saw herself, small, shaking, and already less than the person who'd opened that door 10 minutes ago. His final words stuck to her skin like sleet. "I'm destined for more than this, more than you." Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. Enjoy the story. What the rain learned that night, the November wind cut through Celestine's cardigan like it was tissue. She stood alone on the cracked, moss-bitten stoop of the apartment they'd fought to keep warm all winter last year, and watched the taillights of his car disappear into the slick dark. She counted the seconds between the slam of the door and the moment the red lights vanished, the length of a marriage measured in breath. He'd left $200 on the chipped kitchen table as if irony had loose change. $200 for a wife, $200 for a child he hadn't even looked at. He had not asked how far along. He had not asked if she was okay. He had not asked, "Is it mine?" which would have at least implied that something of him could be this small and sacred. He had asked nothing because he thought he knew everything. Celestine pressed her hand to her flat belly and whispered to a someone that nobody knew existed, "You're not an anchor. You're the ocean." Her voice didn't break. Her heart did. The rain kept writing its endless message on the pavement, a message only water understands, that it always finds a way down and often a way back up. She had once chosen to be small, to be unseen. She had wanted love stripped of context, devotion that didn't flinch at the sight of old money or old power. She had peeled Duval from her name as easily as one peels a label from a bottle, knowing that the sticky shadow of it would remain. She had rented a place with peeling paint above a corner bistro that smelled of oranges and coffee, and had taught herself how to live on tips and grace. And then she had met Michael Peterson. He arrived with a grin and shoes polished within an inch of their lives. He held a rolled-up blueprint the way other men held flowers, a promise between paper. He had called her C after misreading her name on a ticket, and she had laughed and let the new name stick because it made her feel like a person rather than a pedigree. He'd said he wanted the skyline to remember him. She had said she wanted a garden. He wanted his name on glass. She wanted hers on a mailbox. For a while, their dreams had shared a bed. But that night, the night nausea braided with thunder, the night two blue lines felt like a sunrise, she watched him pick up his suitcase and his pride and leave. He had never known he was closing a door on a Duval. Within the hour, the woman on that stoop found herself walking inside to a phone number she'd not dialed in almost 3 years. When she said, "Grandfather," the silence on the other end was a shoreline as old as steel. "Where are you?" he demanded in a voice she thought the world obeyed. She told him everything. The rain listened too. 3 hours, said William Duval. "Pack what you need. You're coming home." Roman 2. The house that never forgot her. They had always called it a house, but it was a country unto itself. The car passed under an arch of oaks so old they seemed carved from memory. The gate swung open as if it had been waiting. The last time she'd crossed that threshold, it had been in rebellion. Now she crossed it because there was a heartbeat inside her that deserved to know the sound of safety. Jonathan Cole, family counsel, keeper of secrets, eyes like a well-read book, oversaw the entire exodus from her old life with surgical grace. He apologized for nothing. He asked for nothing. He made the world function in a way that softened its edges. If a storm had washed her ashore, Jonathan was the man whose hands were always a harbor. She expected reproach. She got arms. Her grandfather looked like time had decided to dress itself in a navy suit. He held her as if she'd never given him reason to be furious, as if she hadn't dragged the Duval name through anonymity to see if love could survive without oxygen. "Welcome home, Celestine," he said into her hair. "Hurt fades, blood stays." She cried until she found dry land. In the mornings, she saw doctors who spoke to her as if she were the singular miracle she felt like. Nutritional plans appeared like kindness on a tray. The linens were so soft her grief slid off them. She slept like a person who had finally put down something heavy. In the afternoons, the library became a war room. She rediscovered calculus of a different kind, margins and market caps, clauses and covenants. Jonathan's voice took her through terrain she'd once refused to map. William taught her the one art she had never been allowed to love, strategy. "People call revenge a storm," he mused one evening as the windows limned with winter light. "But storms burn out. I prefer climate change. Make a new season. Let him step outside without a coat." Celestine learned to speak the language of leverage without raising her voice. She learned what her face did when she lied, almost nothing, and what men's faces did when they realized she was smarter than them, almost everything. She learned how to smile without forgiveness. She learned to sign her name like a tool or a weapon or a promise. She discovered, most terrifying of all, that she liked it. When the baby came, awe collapsed time into a single, gasping instant. A boy, pink and furious with the right to exist. She named him Liam because it tasted like bright things and because it honored no one but himself. When he grasped her finger, she fell in love the way a ship falls into its shadow. "This," she told him, "is yours. This house, this life, this endless field where the geese return in a precise letter of home, yours. You will never have to prove your worth by what you buy. You will never have to beg a man to stay." She swore 2 oaths that morning that her son would be safe, and that the man who had called him an anchor would learn what it felt like to drown without water. Roman 3. The man who hated the mirror in the upward world, there are always people smiling as if their faces ache. Michael married one of them. Brenda Scott had cheekbones sharpened on disdain, and a father whose signature opened doors that never noticed she was the one walking through them. She looped her arm through Michael's and became the tether to a life he'd practiced wanting. They lived in a glass house on a hill that reflected the sun until the neighbors complained. They drove identical cars in a color called Mercury. They posted charity selfies with precisely chosen captions. They hosted evenings that were not parties so much as exhibitions of taste. He had gotten the job he'd coveted, Director of Development, a title that sounded like a philosophy and paid like a mistake he didn't have to regret. Sometimes late at night, if the scotch didn't blur the edges, he saw a girl with her hair in a messy knot and flour on her cheek, laughing because she'd burned the grilled cheese and declared it an experiment. He'd shoved the memory back where he kept other inconveniences, like kindness. He never wondered where she was. Men who believe they are destined for more don't look back. Roads, after all, are for forward. Brenda's world fit him like a suit a size too small. He mistook the tightness for poise. Roman 4. A new company in town when CD Holdings appeared, it was introduced by a logo that whispered money and a prospectus that sang vision. It promised to stitch green tech into concrete and to lace public art through steel, to rebuild not just a waterfront district, but the way a city thinks about itself after sundown. CD Holdings had a board no one could fully name and a bank account that made other accounts wonder what their childhoods had lacked. Scott and Sterling Realty had expected to win Titan Point. Michael had been rehearsing achievements in the mirror. He had not rehearsed loss. CD Holdings made the city's proposal look like a polite apology. They won without appearing to try. The mayor smiled as if the future had slipped a ring on his finger. Dinner at Brenda's parents' house that night tasted like ash. "Who are they?" Brenda's father demanded. "And why didn't you know?" Michael spoke a familiar dialect, assurance rendered meaningless by its glossy finish. He promised to learn. He promised to fight. He promised that this was a blip, a hitch, an anecdote he would one day tell to humanize himself in interviews. Brenda stared at him with a look that suggested interviews might not be his problem. "What is CD?" she asked later, half to him and half to her phone. "Who is behind it?" The internet told her nothing. That was the point. V, the trap you never see Jonathan Cole, was the face, a gentleman so impeccably composed that people mistook his calm for consent and underestimated him accordingly. He announced a secondary phase of Titan Point, the Duval Tower, a 50-story statement threaded with vertical gardens and glass that would reflect clouds back to the sky. He spoke of partnerships with local firms. He said words like community and stewardship without making them sound like props. "Of course," he added in the kind of tone that transforms requests into standards. We expect a personal commitment from our partners, an equity position in the construction phase. We find that when everyone has something to lose, they give us their best. Michael heard only the words equity and best. He was already mapping his speech to the board. At home, spreadsheets blossomed across the glass dining table like frost. Brenda found herself nodding in rhythm with interest rates and percentages that looked like leaps made by people unafraid of gravity. "We're in," she decided. "This is our way back." They leveraged the house they swore would never be leverage. They liquidated portfolios they swore would never be touched. Scott and Sterling's brass shook Michael's hand and smiled for cameras. Jonathan signed with a pen that had outlasted years and men. Celestine watched everything from a room lit like afternoon, though it was midnight. Her office had 2 walls of glass and 1 of books, and the only softness in it was a sketch Liam had made of their dog, companionable and lopsided. Jonathan closed the door after the meeting and said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, "We can still stop it." "Stop it," Celestine glanced up at him. The Duval star, a diamond that had been a woman's rebellion in some century where women weren't allowed such things, caught the light against her collarbone. A trap is only cruel if there is no out. He could have declined. He could have asked for time. He could have checked his own math. Jonathan looked at her as if she were both crusade and caution. "We will not break the law." "We will not scratch the law," she said. "We will hold a mirror and let him fall in love with the wrong face." Vi, the woman in the green dress, she returned to Westport as if she had never belonged and never left. The charity ball smelled like money pretending to be generosity, and had lighting that made everyone handsomer by exactly 4%. Celestine wore emerald silk that made older women remember their youth and younger women reconsider their futures. Her hair was a dark, shepherded wave. On her neck, the Duval star rested like a secret that had decided to come home. Murmurs attached themselves to her shoulders as she walked. She did not gather acquaintances. She allowed them to realize they had known her all along. Michael stood near a champagne fountain, convinced that a shape of silver and bubbles could preserve a reputation if you looked reflective enough. Then he saw her. He didn't know he'd dropped his glass until he heard the small thunder of it shattering. The sound seemed far away, like war in a country you don't have to pronounce. He had always told himself that if he saw Celestine again, he would feel pity. Instead, he felt as if a trapdoor had opened beneath his ribs. Brenda followed his eyes and laughed. "You're staring at money, darling. Try to be subtle." The woman in the green dress turned her head, and their gazes collided. He had once known those eyes the way sailors know the stars. Now they were weather. Whatever warmth they had held for him had migrated. He opened his mouth. He didn't find a word. She didn't need one. She walked away, leaving an orbit where his dignity should have been. Romans 7. Pressure points. The first delay looked like bureaucracy, customs issues with the steel, emails that spoke 6 languages and said no in all of them. The average person would not have noticed the pattern of signatures that made the process suddenly careful. The average person would have cursed bureaucracy and bought another round. Michael had always considered himself above average. He still cursed. Then the soil told a new story. A small patch at the southern edge of the site was less stable than the early report had shown, not catastrophic unless you didn't have money to shore it up. Every not catastrophic added up. He stormed into Jonathan's office with the expression of a man who believes rage is a currency others will accept. "You recommended that steel supplier," he said. "Your slow walking permits. The environmental review is nitpicking our runoff predictions into oblivion. This is sabotage." Jonathan looked at him over the rim of his glasses and appeared to consider the possibility for 2 civil seconds. "Sabotaging the tower would be like setting fire to our own front yard, Mr. Peterson." He steepled his fingers. "Or perhaps your due diligence was as optimistic as your timelines." Michael left with the strangest sensation that his footprints had been measured for a debt. The story in the press took a different shape. It began with careful questions and ended with fully formed innuendo. Safety concerns prompted temporary halt. Read the headline, which, in the language of the city, always meant permanent damage to reputation. His father-in-law's face when he called had the withering calm of a man who has decided which of his fists is more expensive than the other. "Fix it," was all he said, and then he ended the call before Michael could ask if love would be included in his compensation package. At home, the glass walls of their house made a sound like quiet. Brenda began packing her jewelry into small velvet pouches with the efficiency of a relocation specialist. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked without looking at him. "Of course we did," he lied. "You should have recognized who you were competing with," she said. She lifted her chin toward the magazine splayed on the kitchen island, a breathless profile of CD Holdings' unstoppable vision, with a sidebar about a mysterious Duval chair who declined to be photographed. He poured himself a drink. The scotch smelled expensive and final. "You have always wanted more," Brenda murmured. "It would be sexy if you knew when to stop." The scotch didn't answer. It rarely did. Roman 8. The cover story he had been promised 10 glossy pages in the Titans of Industry issue. They had taken photographs of him standing with one hand in his pocket and the other resting against a rolled blueprint in a move he'd practiced since grad school. The photography assistant had told him to think of the future. He had. The issue hit stands 2 months late. The cover was Celestine, though to strangers she had no surname, to the city she had every building. The photographer had captured that fierce stillness of hers, as if motion were beneath her. The article was devout. It discussed innovation, infrastructure, community. It used words he'd once reserved for himself: visionary, architect, inevitable. In the 7th paragraph, far enough into the story that only people who liked humiliation read that far, his name appeared. The phrasing was clinical. Delays and overruns had precipitated a change in management. A direct assumption of responsibility by CD Holdings would ensure the project's success. His phone pinged before he'd looked up from the paragraph. Jonathan's email was surgical, its sentences elegant as scalpel cuts. Contract termination. Clauses invoked. Damages assessed. The number at the bottom had its own weather system. An hour later, security walked him past colleagues whose mouths fumbled sympathy and landed on relief. That evening, his wife placed a pen and 3 documents on the dining table: divorce, division of assets, non-disparagement, like she was setting out dessert forks. "I refuse to be a footnote in your obituary," she said, and left for a house that did not have his name on the mortgage. When the bank repossessed the cars, a man with a clipboard told him to remove his personal items. He stood there for long seconds, realizing that the only thing he could claim was the faint smell of cologne and fear. He moved into a motel that hid behind something that called itself a diner and learned that the smell of bleach is not a smell but a decision. He asked the mirror questions. The mirror asked him nothing. Roman 9. Chartwell, the text arrived in the hour between a man's worst thought and his second worst. "Miss Duval will grant you a meeting. Chartwell. 800 p.m. Be punctual." Chartwell was a restaurant where silence tasted like money. It was a place where the servers had no visible seams. He remembered taking Brenda there to celebrate his promotion, making promises he didn't know came factory installed with expiration dates. He spent the last of his good shirt money on starch. He stole dignity from a past version of himself who had not hidden it well. He walked inside and watched the maitre d's face shift from contempt to worship at the mention of her name. He followed a server to a corner, the sort of place people request when they plan endings. She sat with her back to the window and the city in her eyes. The diamond at her throat found light and drank it. She did not stand. She inclined her head the way queens ask you to approach without humiliating you by making you bow. He sat. "Thank you for," he began. "For making the time," she supplied, dry. "Your calendar seemed flexible." When she smiled, it was so exact he could measure its absence against all the times she had smiled at him once. "Why?" The word fell out of him. "Why do this to me?" She studied him like a problem set she no longer found challenging. "Because life rarely delivers the right lessons to the people who need them. I prefer not to leave it to chance." "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know who you were." He leaned forward as if proximity could buy understanding. "You were a waitress." He shut his eyes. "You hid. You let me believe." I allowed you to reveal yourself, she said. You had a chance to be a decent man without the prize of being seen doing it. You failed. He groped for the one truth that wasn't a lie. I was scared. The confession made him feel smaller than even the motel did. I wanted to be someone. I wanted applause, she finished. Not love. Love is private. Applause requires an audience. She lifted a hand and a waiter appeared like a trick. Drink, he flinched. She laughed then, not with delight, but with the recognition of a story finishing one of its own sentences. Forgive me, you can't afford what you want. Would you like water? Please. For the first time, he realized how thirsty he was. She placed her phone on the table and slid it toward him. The screen showed a boy in a sweater the color of Jane's he hadn't worn in years. The child was on an older man's shoulders, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. The older man's expression was the blueprint for buildings that last. This is Liam, she said, and the syllables felt like a blessing he'd never learn. He loves cranes and has a stuffed bear named Admiral. He believes crows can understand jokes. He thinks broccoli is a suggestion. He is the kindest person I know. Michael swallowed a sound that wanted to be an entire life. My. No, a blade of a syllable. He is not yours. Biology is not ownership. It is potential. You canceled yours. What do you want from me? He whispered. Do you want me to beg? You already are. Then tell me the script. I'll say your lines. The unexpected softness in her gaze nearly undid him. I didn't come to hear you perform grief. I came because curses are louder when you say them in person. He looked around wildly, wanting a waiter to reappear and rescue him from the intimacy of hell. There was no one. I built a world where you are noise, she continued. You will not approach my son. You will not speak of me. You will rebuild your life as if I were a myth you cannot prove. If you attempt to harm what I have made, I will not stop at your name. I will end the need for it. He nodded. He would have nodded at anything. And one more thing, she said, with a mildness that would one day keep him up nights. The corner bistro where we met. I bought the building. Aisha owns half the restaurant now. It is a place where tips are fair and futures are long. The block you once called Blight will be the pulse of the city's art district. The apartment above it will become a shelter for women whose lives were knocked out of their hands. It was going to be called the Beacon. I renamed it Anchor House. He flinched, a man impaled on his own metaphor. For your meal, she added gently, setting cash on the linen between them with the same precise flick he had once used to fling bills at love. And a bit extra. It should cover you for a while. It's all I have for you. Please, he said again, without dignity. Let me see him, once. No, calm, final, like a gavel. I will not make my son practice forgiveness on a man who would only add the skill to his resume. She stood, and the air followed her. He sat for a long time after she left, long enough that the city began to shift from evening to whatever darkness becomes when it grows patient. He tried to remember the last meal he had enjoyed. He realized enjoyment had been a performance, too. He took the cash and left a tip that felt like an apology to someone who didn't need it. The quiet season he moved. He found work where work didn't ask for lineage, pouring concrete, lifting what was heavy, being thanked in sandwiches instead of checks. He was careful with his back because regret had already decided to live there. He stopped drinking because the mirror had refused to bargain. Sometimes a child's laughter in a park folded him in half, a surprise bruise. He didn't tell anyone his story because he finally understood it wasn't worth the 100% certainty with which he'd once told it. Brenda married a man who chose cufflinks for desire. She learned the trick of loving someone exactly as much as the prenup demanded. They attended galas where donations were measured in decibels, and she smiled because that too was a skill. Scott and Sterling found a new rising star. The city forgot the footnote who had briefly blazed and then extinguished himself. Celestine did not return to the stoop where the story had begun. She had bought the building. She didn't need to borrow its ghosts. She took Liam to see cranes and let him wear a hard hat that slid down over his eyes. She watched him lower his arms and stop crying each time she said, "I'm here," and wondered if those 2 words were the true inheritance she could give him. Duval Tower rose from the repaired earth, spiraling a fraction wider than its competitor would have, as if abundance were an angle you could learn to draw. When it opened, the city gathered and breathed as if for the first time. The mayor cut a ribbon that had cost less than the microphones describing it. Children stared at their reflections in the mirrored lobby and giggled because they still thought magic was a kind of glass. At the ribbon cutting, Jonathan stood beside Celestine as a partner, not a shadow. William did not attend because he had decided to let the future arrive without being told how. He did watch the live stream from his study. When the camera panned to the crowd, it lingered, just once, on a small boy holding a balloon that had decided it preferred the ceiling. William raised his glass to the screen. "Well done," he told a room that did not require volume to remember. Celestine gave a speech that didn't sound like a speech. She spoke of the city like a person you could love without adding your name to theirs. She thanked teams and overlooked no one. She invoked bees and bridges and a grandmother who once told her that strength is a house with more than one door. Later, in the quiet of her office, she wrote a letter she would not send. She did that sometimes, wrote to the her who had stood on a stoop and thought that the night was too big. "You did not make a mistake," she wrote. "You made a choice. He made a mistake, and then you made another choice." The difference matters. It is the small seam between fate and courage. And to Liam, she added, "When you ask me why people leave, I will say, because they are afraid of the person they have to be to stay. When you ask me what we do with that fear, I will say, we put on a coat. Then we step outside into the season we made." Roman 11. The last knock years later, on a day when winter pretended to be spring, there was a knock at the service entrance of Duval Tower. No one used that entrance unless they understood the building. The security guard watched the camera feed and frowned at a face ages had chiseled mean. "Can I help you?" the guard asked when he stepped into the small atrium. "I'm looking for a job," said the man, holding a tool belt like a prayer. "Maintenance. I heard you were hiring." His voice did not explain that he had once imagined himself above bolts and below the stars. It did not need to. The guard handed him a form. The man began to fill it out with the carefulness of someone who no longer believed he could afford mistakes. Under name, he wrote Michael. Under experience, he listed 50 places and one skill. "I can fix what's broken." The HR assistant carried the clipboard upstairs and placed it in a tray where paper was both fiction and record. It stopped there for a while, then moved, because systems either digest or spit out. When Celestine saw it, she did not put a pen through his application. She did not pick up the phone. She did not tell security to escort him out. She set the paper down and reminded herself of the difference between retribution and obsession. Then she called Jonathan. "If he qualifies, she said. "We are not the kind of company that makes exceptions to harm or to rescue." "Are you sure?" Jonathan asked. She stared at the skyline and saw, reflected in the glass, the version of herself who could be merciless. That woman had built this tower. The other woman would make its policies. "I am." He did not get the job. Someone did who needed it more. Months later, he found work at a different building across town with stairs that squeaked like complaint. He learned where the pipes shuddered and which elevator lied about being fixed. He showed up. He carried quiet with him like a less heavy bag. He saw a child one morning in the lobby wearing a red scarf that looked like joy. The mother turned just enough that he understood the world had given him mercy without a face. He stepped into the stairwell before anyone could see his knees. Roman 12. Anchor House, the sign went up on a spring afternoon fragrant with cut grass. The neighborhood had argued with itself about this building for a decade. Artists wanted light, developers wanted high rent, and the old men on the corner wanted the thing they always wanted, evidence that they wouldn't be erased. The letters on the sign were simple white against wood, Anchor House. A mural rose behind it. An ocean turned into a map of palms open and empty so that whatever you placed in them could be chosen, not begged. Aisha, the bistro owner who had stayed when rent became a dare, cut a ribbon with hands that had learned bones by carrying plates. She cried halfway through her speech because the words safe and women elbow each other in the throat when they try to share a sentence. Celestine stood in the back, a baseball cap pulled down to boring. She had come not to be thanked, but to listen. Stories unravel when they get air. She let them. One of the women, the kind whose gaze stopped flinching yesterday, said it best. "Here," she told a reporter who expected a slogan, "we learn not to edit ourselves to be loved." Celestine went home and let the sentence live on her fridge. Roman 13. The weather changes. She never became the woman who forgives to be seen forgiving. She never became the woman who punishes to be sure she's punished enough. Somewhere between those two candle flames, she learned to live in the heat. Well, she learned to learn. When Liam was 8, he asked what his father looked like. She described a man who had once wanted to be admired and had mistaken the sound of admiration for proof of his worth. Liam frowned, thinking hard, and then, so he was just a kid who didn't get what he wanted. She loved his precision. All of us are sometimes. Do I have to meet him? In his tone there was no fear, only the beginnings of ethics. No, she said, you only have to be the person who can answer that question for yourself for the rest of your life. Okay. He accepted this like a fact about gravity. Can we go see the cranes? They drove to Titan Point and watched the river pretend to be still. The Duval Tower sometimes masqueraded as a cloud. Is it weird that buildings feel like trees to me? Liam asked, his face tilted to the sun. Only if you don't water them, she answered, and he nodded, because watering things was his entire religion. Roman 14. The unforgettable part on the anniversary of the night rain learned her secret. She stood on the same stoop that had once held her grief. It had been sandblasted and painted and mended so well you could almost forget what it had been. The block had a heartbeat now, music from the bistro windows, a mural that grew at the corner as if color had decided the air was its friend, kids hollering a ball by the curb without fear. They'd installed a plaque in the brick, nothing decorative, just dates and the names of women who had slept safe because a building had decided to be kind. She ran her fingers over the engraving. There were moments, still, when the old sensation rose, of being measured by a scale that did not know how to weigh love. She would shake her head like a dog emerging from water, and the feeling would slough off. She thought of the man who had said he was destined for more, and how small those words looked now against the building that had made room for more of the right things. She went home. On the way, the sky flung the smallest rain. It felt like blessing or memory. She rolled down her window and let it flick her fingers. At the gate, Jonathan waited with paperwork and cookies because he believed secretaries baked. She signed the paperwork. She ate half a cookie because she believed in moderation only where desserts were concerned. She carried the other half upstairs. In the boys' room, Liam was building a city of blocks that leaned into one another like cousins. Mom, he asked as she lay on the rug next to him, is it true that one day someone will build a building taller than yours? Of course, she said. That is the point. Does that make you sad? No, she answered. It means the world learned how. Later, she tucked him in and read from a book where animals learned that dens are promises. He fell asleep mid-sentence because the chapter had gotten boring, which she liked. She wanted bored Mondays for him, the kind that other children would someday envy without knowing they did. She stepped onto her balcony, the night breathing like an old friend. The city below wore itself without apology. She lifted her face to the sky and closed her eyes. The rain had ended. The streets would steam tomorrow morning like a lesson. You can change the weather, she thought. You can decide winter ends here. She had once been a woman knocking on a door and begging to be let in. She had become the woman who builds the house and chooses who can rest inside. She did not ask the night to memorize her. She preferred a quieter eternity. And somewhere across the city, a man who had called love a weight sat on a thin mattress and stared at a ceiling fan that made promises about coolness it couldn't keep. He turned off the light. He learned that sleep comes when you stop narrating your losses and let them settle like silt. This is the unforgettable part, the part that will sit in your throat when other stories flutter away. She didn't ruin him. He had done that. She changed the season, and in that new weather, she planted gardens. Years from now, no one would remember the exact words that closed her front door in the rain, but mothers would remember Anchor House. Children would remember a tower that gave birds a place to rest between clouds. And somewhere a boy named Liam would grow into his shadow without fear that stepping into it meant stepping down. You called me an anchor, she might have told the night once. I became the harbor, and the harbor is where ships begin.